Hi everyone, my name is Felicia Bisnath and I'm a third-year PhD student at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And my presentation today is about language ideology and language documentation and how it relates to sign language typology. Before I start, I need to thank my wonderful advisor, Salvi Nambudiri-Pad, as well as two professors at the University of Michigan, Marlies Baptista and Jeff Heath, and also Caleb Bishtel at the University of Bergen. So this presentation comes out of a bigger paper investigating mouthing constructions in sign languages. So I'll first define mouthing. So mouthings are movements of the mouth in sign languages that correspond with those movements that are made in spoken languages when articulating specific synchronic words. And I think of them as a multimodal language contact phenomenon. So in this example here, it comes from New Zealand Sign Language and it's the sign for mother. And as you can see, the sinus mouth movements correspond to the mouth movements that are made when producing the English word mother. So that's what I'm interested in. So for an overview of this presentation, first I'll give some background and then I'll talk about documentation inequalities and sign language typology. And then I will talk about documentation and description of mouthing constructions in sign languages. So for the bigger project that I worked on, this is a sort of visual summary of it. And I was interested in mouthing and the relationship between mouthings and different kinds of linguistic ecologies. And then, of course, that got me into typology, and language documentation, as we know, feeds typology. And then what is documented is related to ideologies about what counts as part of a language. So in this presentation, I'll be talking about some thoughts that I had and observations that I made in this area that's highlighted in yellow. So that would be the relationship between typology, ideology, and language documentation and description. And if you want to find out more about this project or to keep up with it, you can look at my website or you can follow me on Twitter. So in linguistics, we group languages in different ways. So we can group languages by modality. We can have sign languages, we can have spoken languages, we can have tactile languages. We can also group languages by some kind of formal property. We can group them by genealogy, and we can also group them by socio-historical properties. And one example of that is creoles. Now, these groupings are not equally able to predict structural properties. So, for example, a grouping like synthetic languages tells you that you can expect to see a lot of inflection, while a grouping like creoles, at least according to the uniformitarian perspective, is only a socio-historical grouping and it doesn't identify a structural type. So what I want to argue is that sign language types are similar to creoles in that they are defined in socio-historical or socio-cultural terms. And I'm using two groupings, so deaf and rural sign languages. And I use these terms because they are the ones that are used in Glottolog. But I must say that these names and even this division has already been problematized in sign language linguistics. So it's definitely not agreed upon. But getting back to what a deaf sign language is, the profile of a deaf sign language is that it's associated with congregations of deaf people in urban centers, usually at deaf schools and clubs, as well as with a larger non-signing hearing population and with deaf people being born into hearing non-signing families. And the profile of a rural sign language is that they are associated with isolated areas of developing countries. It doesn't necessarily need to be developing countries, but there is an element of isolation, at least. And it's also associated with hearing people being able to sign or communicate with deaf people, as well as a high incidence of congenital deafness. So as we can see, these profiles identify two different contexts of language emergence and acquisition. Now, in talking about categories, the notion of prototypes is relevant. And the best exemplar notion of prototypes comes from psychology. And in that definition, members have a family resemblance, so they can be more or less like some prototype. And the prototype is an abstraction of the most typical member. And Mofwene identifies another kind of prototype, which has to do with the narrative structure of linguistics. And this is the first specimen notion. And in Creole linguistics, that refers to the Creole that was studied first or most. And what Mufwani does is he cautions against conflating the best exemplar notion with the first specimen notion of prototypes. So, in general, Creoles have not been documented as well as more powerful languages, and within Creoles, the most written about type is the Atlantic Creoles. So, basically, Mufwani is saying to not generalize about Creoles based on limited data, which clearly references language documentation and description and inequalities in those areas. Now, let's briefly distinguish between documentation and description. So, documentation has to do with determining the type of data to collect, the methods, processing, and representation of data, while description has to do with the representation of patterns underlying data, and that's related to the production of grammars and dictionaries. However, both documentation and description are inseparable, and as we know, documentation and description feed linguistic typology, so they're in a sort of symbiotic relationship with each other. Now, for my method, what I did is I identified a sample of 37 sign languages. You can see them. There were 26 deaf sign languages. They're in the dark blue, and 11 rural sign languages that are in this orange color. And the proportions that I have here are the proportion, they reflect the proportions found in Glottolog. And then I just counted the presence of 4 mouthing constructions in different resources. And for me, a mouthing construction is a unit, and it's either a pairing of a mouthing and a manual sign or just a mouthing. And this unit has some singular meaning. So in our New Zealand Sign Language example, I'm thinking of the mouthing of mother plus the manual sign for mother being a single unit that corresponds to the meaning mother. Okay, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about documentation inequalities. So the data that you're seeing here comes from Glottolog. On the x-axis, we see number of resources, and on the y-axis, we see the sign languages in my sample. And the resource types are shown on the far right. They aren't represented in this plot, but I just wanted to give an idea of what different resource types there are in Glottolog. So for example, you can have a long grammar or a grammar sketch. And I must say that the plot here does not represent the data that I used in my study, but they are the resources that are listed in Glottolog for the sign languages in my sample. So this is sort of post hoc, right? And I'm using my sample as a microcosm of Glottolog. So the pink represents deaf sign languages and the blue represents rural sign languages. And of course, one pretty noticeable thing about this plot is that ASL at the top, ASL really outstrips the number of resources for all the other sign languages. So the solid pink line shows the mean for deaf sign languages, and that's maybe about 8 or 9. The dotted pink line shows the mean without ASL, so it drops to about 7. And the solid blue line shows the mean for rural sign languages, and that's about 5. Now, going to my results, on the x-axis, we see the different constructions that I looked at. So we have 4 categories, and then on the y-axis, we see the number. And then we also have 5 reporting categories. So we have 1 for if the construction was not reported, then if it was reported as present in a deaf sign language, reported as absent in a deaf sign language, and then reported as present in a rural sign language, and finally reported as absent in a rural sign language. And this is what it looks like. This is what the distribution looks like. And the general patterns is there's more unreporting than reporting. There's more reporting in deaf versus rural sign languages. And the only construction that's reported to be absent is free mouthing. So just to summarize, to kind of bring together some ideas from what I just talked about, there's more documentation of deaf than rural sign languages. ASL resources outnumber the resources for all other sign language types. Sign language types are based on sociocultural profiles, and these profiles may be systematically associated with inequalities in documentation. And from the uniformitarian perspective on Creoles, sociolinguistic or sociocultural or sociohistorical groupings do not necessarily translate into structural profiles. So it's necessary to be cautious when differentiating among groups or creating dichotomies when one group is systematically disadvantaged and or underdocumented. So basically, the rural versus deaf sign language dichotomy is kind of like the Creole non-Creole dichotomy. And as groups, less is known about rural sign languages than deaf sign languages. And so there's sort of like an epistemological problem with assigning structural profiles or really cleanly demarcating these two groups because one is associated with underdocumentation. Okay, so back to my results, and I'll go into more detail now. So what I've done here is that I've just ordered them to show that morphophonological constructions are reported more than congruent constructions, and then we have morphosyntactic constructions, and then finally free constructions. Okay, so in morphophonological mouthing, there's 3 types, and I'm just going to talk about one. And in this type, the manual sign is the same across a group, with mouthing identifying a specific type. So in the example that we see here, it's color terms in Adamo-Orobe Sign Language. And in the pictures are the signs for white, black, and red. And they all share the same manual form that has a meaning that's like sense, but they differ in the Akan mouthing that they use. So, for example, the color term for white in Adamo-Orobe Sign Language is the manual sign meaning sense plus a mouthing corresponding to the Akan word fita, which means white. So, morphophonological mouthing was reported most, and the polysemous type was also reported most. And this reporting may be greater because of the contrastive role of mouthing in this construction. And then next we have congruent mouthings. So I define this as the manual sign and the mouthing. They can both be glossed with the same word. And the example here comes from Russian Sign Language. So the manual sign meaning house is paired with a mouthing corresponding to the Russian word for house, dom, and together the construction refers to house. So this kind of mouthing may be the most common kind of mouthing within sign languages, but it's also unlikely to be explicitly mentioned. And this is because by definition, the mouthing does not produce a meaning contrast. And also this mouthing may not consistently appear with the same sign, and different mouthings may appear with the same sign. In addition to this, while related to this, congruent mouthing is not often represented in glosses. So Julie Hoeksang, following Slope in 2008, calls this the tyranny of glossing. So in the picture on the right, we see glosses of an ASL video, and clearly we can't see the form of any of the signs. All we have is how these signs are identified in English. And this kind of sign language representation is commonly used and it is convenient, but it obscures mouthing and non-manuals in general. And anyway, mouthings and non-manuals are usually only glossed when they're explicitly being discussed. This means that it's not possible to find out about them from looking at most examples in sign language papers. And mouthing also isn't found in certain documentation resources like the ones that I show here. However, and for example, ASL Sign Bank is described as a documentation tool that keeps track of visual ASL signs and their ID glosses, which are unique textual labels for each sign. And ASL Sign Bank, the intention is to use it for the annotation of ASL videos of naturalistic ASL use by a wide range of users. So this means that basically the people who created or who are responsible for ASL Sign Bank, they are only interested in the manual parts of signs because there's a lot of variation in the non-manual components. And in contrast to this, you do see mouthing in dictionaries. So, for example, we have mouthing in the Online Dictionary of New Zealand Sign Language, in the Swedish Sign Language Dictionary, the Finnish Sign Language Dictionary, and in the Danish Sign Language Dictionary. However, in the Danish Sign Language Dictionary, the mouthing is not part of the phonological description of signs, and this is for searching purposes. And just to exemplify differences in documentation and description, we have the entries for cat in the ASL Sign Bank and in the Danish Sign Language Dictionary. So in the Sign Bank, there's no mouthing or facial expression at all, while in the Danish Sign Language Dictionary, we can see the mouthing of the Danish word for cat. And next, we have morphosyntactic mouthing. So in this kind of mouthing, the manual sign and the mouthing have independent specific meanings that can combine to find a complex morphosyntactic construction with compositional meaning. So the example that I have here is from Sign Language of the Netherlands, and the sign means eat, the manual sign means eat, and it's paired with a mouthing corresponding to the Dutch word for bread, which is brood, and together the construction, that pairing refers to eat bread. So the example that we just talked about, the mouthing is the object of the verb, and this kind of construction may be in competition with constructions with dedicated positions for objects. So morphosyntactic mouthing was the third most reported construction, and it may be because of this competition. We have this example here from Sign Language of the Netherlands, and this shows the manual components of a sentence. So that's in the blue, and altogether they mean I would have been obliged to adapt and eat the caterpillar. And what's bolded is the object, so that's caterpillar, and this is showing that there's a position for objects of verbs following the verb, and that this is an alternative to the morphosyntactic mouthing construction, and this alternative could be preferred in sign language description. It's also possible that this kind of construction can be rare anyway. And finally, we have free mouthing, which is the only construction type that was reported as absent. And in this kind of mouthing construction, the mouthing appears without a manual sign. So the example that we have here comes from Chinese Sign Language, and in it there isn't any manual sign. It's just the mouthing of the word for Y in Chinese to mean Y while using Chinese Sign Language. So free mouthing is often reported as a fallback strategy in Sign Language of the Netherlands and in Chinese Sign Language and in Norwegian Sign Language, and it's used when the hands are occupied. However, when we think about language documentation and planning of language documentation, in these sessions, the hands are likely to be free. So this sort of shows that language documenters should be aiming to document and describe language use in various contexts, else they may miss some things like free mouthing. Now, as I said before, free mouthing is the only construction that was reported absent, and this could be because of negative ideologies. So, for example, in Norwegian Sign Language, signers do not consider free mouthing to be acceptable signs, and in Turkish Sign Language, mouthing is said to, it cannot be produced alone. All right, so to summarize, documentation practices impact if mouthing is reported or represented, and this may disproportionately impact the reporting of certain kinds of constructions, specifically congruent and free mouthing. And there's also differences across sign language databases and dictionaries. And descriptive analysis may favor reporting of constructions that produce differences in meaning. And I would be specifically referring to morphophonological and morphosyntactic mouthing. However, morphosyntactic mouthing constructions may be in competition with constructions that have dedicated sequential positions in the manual channel. Now for some conclusions. Sign language types are linked to inequalities in documentation and description. The uniformitarian perspective on Creoles warns against dichotomies like this because they are based on documentation inequalities. And mouthing is used in multiple ways in sign languages that may not be captured by practices in documentation and description. And this limits the potential understanding of contact between spoken and sign languages, so i.e. multimodal language contact. And that's all I have for you. Thank you very much for listening, and you can find me on Twitter and at my website. Thank you.